Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, April 16th, 2021. Picking up where I left off last week, I did indeed finish this collection, How to Sit, a memoir in stories and essays by Tyrese Coleman. I don't have a whole lot more to add. I'd already been finished with most of it by the time I was talking last week. The final story, How to Mourn, is perhaps the one where she is testing this hypothesis of a memoir in stories and essays, where she breaks the fourth wall and talks a lot to the readers and admits that she's putting a lot of both fiction and nonfiction into her feelings around her grandmother's death. And part of it goes into her, with her grandmother at the end, but a lot more of it is about her feelings around the incident. And she writes this about why she's doing that. I find this quote from Seymour Chapman, a film and literary critic who studied narrative and narrative structure, illuminating to my personal ruminations on why I write. He said, "When I enter the fictional contract, I add another self. I become the implied reader." It bothered me, truly saddened me, how I was more concerned about writing about my grandmother dying than I was about her actual death. When I sat down to write the story, an unrealized grief over my lack of empathy drew me to the third person. It's also confusing, this being a writer and being a human being, and wishing your real life wasn't true sometimes. As Chapman suggests, though, it boils down to the audience and the fictional contract. If the narratee and the implied reader coalesce, if we are narrating our own stories, a story unique to our own lives, a story in which only we can know the real meaning, one in which only we know the past, present, and future, then who are we writing for? Why does my own story sound better in the third person? So yeah, I think in part it comes down to her discomfort with how she feels or doesn't feel things in the traditional memoir style. And fiction gives her a little bit of distance from herself, even though she wants to write about these issues in her own life. So I do find that rather compelling. Again, like I said last week, this sort of dashed off stuff isn't really my favorite. It's sort of a mood read sometimes. I do think it gets to the visceral nature of what it can feel like, to be in, somebody's head. It's really very insular sort of writing in someone's head. But I am glad I gave this a go. Funnily enough, there was a recent Book Riot article about actually standing against the recent trend of autofiction. But I feel like this is different because it's marketed as a memoir. It's not autofiction. She's not, if she's privileging anything, she's privileging the fact that, yes, this is about my own life. This is a memoir. And she isn't like hiding behind autofiction. Like, is it about me? Isn't it? I don't know. What's real? What isn't? I feel like this is more honest and doesn't really fall under autofiction. Because otherwise I might feel the same with regards to the autofiction label, that it's not staying in its own lane. And if something's actually primarily defined as fiction, it should be fiction. That's my take too. But this is a memoir, and if anything, maybe I'm more okay with the idea of memoirs being open and being murky, because it's about your own life. And it also gets to the idea really of what is memory. Like sometimes I read memoirs and they're so specific and so detailed, and I'm like, how true can all of this be? How much can you really remember of all of these details and all of this dialogue, and how much of it is a reconstruct in your own head? So in a way, it's more honest even to say that a memoir is partial fiction, because, it can't all be 100% fact. That's not the way our brains remember things. So yeah, and in summary, I feel like memoirs really are more murky, and this one may be more honest about it. But fiction should be fiction. So anyway, that's where I come down on this. And I'll link to that Book Riot article down below. Next, this week, well, I ended up listening to a full other audiobook that I wasn't intending to, which might put my reading for April up to 11 books, that is, if I actually finish everything else I need to finish. But anyway, I listened to We Hunt the Flame by Hafsah Faizal. This is a YA epic fantasy, and I wanted to read it in large part because this was the first book of a duology, We Hunt the Flame, and the second book came out this year, and I was considering reading it for the Goodreads Choice Awards. I talked about it in a video, in fact, which I'll link down below. That being said, I didn't like this book very much, so I think I won't be continuing on to the second one in the duology. I don't like being too harsh on writers, especially like, debut novelists and people who obviously put work into what they're doing, but overall, this was a very generic YA epic fantasy novel. All of the characters basically felt like constructs that we've seen before and tropes we've seen before, but that they weren't developed enough. And like the cynic in me might say that the writer or the editors just were hearkening on old characters that you might just sort of insert into these new characters rather than doing, the legwork of the actual character work. We have the tough girl who has to go out on her own against a patriarchal system and take care of her family and take care of her community and fight the man and is standoffish and doesn't believe in love. And, then we have the tortured prince who is the minion of the one-dimensional bad guy, basically doing his bidding and feeling very tortured about it. They come together with different plot lines, but going toward the same MacGuffin, and have a friends to enemies romance that felt very forced to me. And they're also joined by a couple of side characters who are the same sort of, I guess, snarky and sarcastic, and we always have that sort of witty banter going on, but I don't know, it didn't really work for me because the characters weren't incredibly fleshed out, so, witty banter wasn't really making up for it. Some reviewers even accuse this book of queer baiting because the male character who's closest to the broody prince, he is sort of a snarky sort of Lothario, and a lot of attention between the two guys is paid to like flirtatious affectations, like where they really do seem to be openly flirting with each other. And I assume this was not intentional because the broody prince ends up with, the girl who's unlike any other girl. And again, I guess I feel like it came across that way in part because he's a caricature more than a character that the author was putting down, and she wasn't thinking through really how the relationships actually looked. I don't know. Another thing about the patriarchy point really is because I feel like, patriarchy is a fertile and legitimate ground to, explore in fantasy and in other genres as well. But really, it was very unfair here because we only cared about how patriarchy affected our main character, that boo-hoo, she wasn't allowed to be who she wanted to be and what she wanted to do. But we didn't really go into the broader world and how it affects people. And that's another thing I talk about even in YA fantasy I enjoy sometimes, is that the world building is so secondary. And I feel like, again, I think I was the most intrigued by the world building or the promise of world building that really wasn't fleshed out at all in this book. But what it would add to the story is a sense that these characters aren't just propelled by the plot, and that it's not just about them being the center of the universe, but that there's broader themes. And I'm all for character-driven fiction in all genres, but if there's nothing in the world except for them inside their own heads, and a lot of this long book was just them angsting about things in their heads, but if that's all there is, it's just not enough, And I feel like there's so many more interesting things to say about people in the world through the lens of fantasy aimed at teenagers than what was put down here. The world building had potential that wasn't really fleshed out. The characters, they were just so stale, I think. There really wasn't much more to them than, the stereotypes, tropes from other stories, really. People were mentioning the Hunger Games and the Sarah J. Maas books a lot. So I'm disappointed, though that being said, I'm almost 100% sure the YA fantasy book I'll enjoy the most this year is A Sky Beyond the Storm by Sabaa Tahir, which was the final in her Ember in the Ashes quartet. And funnily enough, the two voice actors who play the lovers in the Sabaa Tahir quartet played the lovers in this audiobook as well. So I also found that very disconcerting. I mean, that's really no fault of anybody, but, there's aspects to the Sabaa Tahir love story that are a little overwrought, but the rest of the story is so well fleshed out and the characters are just on three-dimensional journeys throughout that, I see it as, a huge success story, and to hear these same actors play overwrought lovers who are much more just tropey and two-dimensional. It almost felt like they were doing a parody or something. But that's, of course, just because of me and what I've listened to in the past. So yeah, not really my cup of tea, unfortunately. Something that I definitely think will be much more in my wheelhouse is this book, Jews and Words by Amos Oz and Fania Oz-Salzberger, which I picked in my last video, which was my page 112 tag for this month. I'll link to that video down below. I was very impressed by the writing on page 112. I've only read one chapter so far. It's a very long, sprawling chapter, and I remain in love. It's a book that posits that the legacy of Jews is not in our archaeological past or our genetic past, which can be and has been contested in some cases. Like certainly most people don't believe the Bible, for example, is 100% accurate. But that our real legacy is in the stories and in the words that we pass down from generation to generation. And it's something that these two authors particularly go at as secular Israelis and atheists. And already there's passages in here that are just making me think of some of the Maybe Midrash videos I've seen so far this year, because Maybe Midrash is a readathon that is about religion that's run by a bunch of agnostics and atheists who get really caught up, I think, in the idea of what are we doing if there is no God? What are we talking about here? And Amos Oz is really one of my favorite Jewish writers. I just have always felt such a kinship to what he writes about and what he believes, or what he believed. He is gone now. But I just feel that kinship, and I almost think of him as a prophet in a way. My Jewish atheist prophet. And this is what he and his daughter write about the idea of Jewish atheism versus, what it means, this heritage really means. As Jewish atheists, we take religion to be a great human invention. As such, it is neither falsehood nor forgery. A skeptic might grasp the Jewish scriptures, like other holy texts, as an apocryphal web of prejudices. A Marxist might deem them tools of oppression, although in this case the oppressors were nebbish, no grander than a convoy of frail and tattered rabbis. A multiculturalist will find nothing in the Bible that is less or more interesting than any other ethnocultural endeavor. But by our secular lights, these scriptures and their textual progeny are a legacy of collective human greatness. That is because we are privileged with a new vista of amazement. Precisely the critical, selective, and discerning reading, the modern and secular reading, can generate a sense of awe. Speakers of modern Hebrew, a language barely 1 century old, have been granted a brand new ticket to an ancient cultural spectacle. And the non-believers among them may gasp at the notion that this spectacle has no divine scriptwriter-producer. Backstage, thousands upon thousands of historical players and authors are at work, all strictly human, inhabiting a tri-millennial line. This is breathtaking. We don't like all of it. We don't ascribe either historical factuality or scientific certainty to much of it. We are not morally bound by any of it, but we find so much that is true, good, and insightful in parts of the Jewish bookshelf that we can claim to have replaced faith with wonder. So yeah, I love this, I love it. The one thing I don't love is how I am not a modern Hebrew speaker. That is, in a way their hubris, a hubris that is actually true, that this modern Hebrew language, although they go in the book how it's, there's differences between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, but it brings secular Jews to the words of the Bible that when you don't speak Hebrew, you don't quite have. But then there's other parts in this book that are just about how, reading any Jewish literature binds you to Judaism, even if you're not, 100% religious, which is something I also think about a lot because I'm only quasi-religious. But I take so much out of reading literature. I mean, and in English, but English is still a legitimate language, isn't it? Certainly of the diaspora, with such a large minority of Jews living in the U.S. alone. And you know, in fact, they actually wrote this book in English. I was looking for the translator information in my page 112 tag, and there was none. And it's because they intentionally wrote this book in English, I think wanting to make it part of a series on Jewish learning that's also written in English, and maybe to reach out to Jews like me. I don't know, and cut out the middleman. I don't know. Oh yeah, I just, it's going to be intense reading. I mean, I've only read one, like, chapter that's long and kind of exhausting, and there's 3 more and an epilogue, and oh yeah, I'm liking it. I also like the ideas they come back to in learning about how Judaism goes into parables about you know, the teacher-student or the father-son, and that just comes out in a lot of the ways of how stories are structured, but also how learning in Jewish religious spaces are structured. About passing down stories generation to generation or in a classroom. And it just got me to thinking in a way, because, you know, this is written by a father and daughter, although this isn't, the style isn't, you know, a back and forth style usually. They're sort of talking in one voice, and very rarely do they, you know, sort of differentiate each other. But here they are. Here they are, in fact. There's a picture of Amos Oz and his daughter Fania Oz-Salzberger, which, you know, I love as well, because we so rarely get, you know, first of all, women in these spaces, you know, at least in historical aspects, we rarely get them. We also rarely get intergender, you know, expression like this of, you know, fathers and daughters coming together. So, or at least less so, of course. And so, I don't know, I'm just, I'm liking this. It seems like I'm already starting to talk about maybe Midrash themes, even though it's not May yet. And I intend to read 2 other books in May for maybe Midrash, but who knows, I'll probably be propping this one back up as well to talk about in May. But I'll also probably ramble out a few more thoughts next week. I do want to finish the book quickly, because as always, there's a lot more on the docket. I keep on talking about, like, reading 10, 11 books this month, and the next one for me will be this one. This is Fathoms, The World in the Whale by Rebecca Giggs. This is a book that has to do with whales and whale society, but I also think it also goes a little bit into human society and perhaps climate issues. And I am reading this one for the BookTube Prize. I am judging nonfiction Group C for the quarterfinals, and so I won't be saying any more about this book until the round is over, but if you want to hear any of my preliminary thoughts about my ballot, I will link to more information down below. So that about covers it for me now. Another update I will give from my rambling last week is that I indeed got my first Pfizer shot of the COVID vaccine on Wednesday. Everything went pretty smoothly. You know, I was going to a local community center, and the line, you know, moved pretty swiftly, and there'll be my county will be calling me, I guess, in a couple of weeks to set up the next appointment, and I have my little COVID card in my wallet, just waiting for that second shot, and so I feel half vaxxed right now, but hopefully when I'm fully vaxxed, everything will go okay. I'm a little concerned about side effects. My sister, after she got her second Pfizer shot, she spent, I think, the day on the floor in a blanket. So I don't know how that bodes for me, but I guess we'll see in a few weeks. In the meantime, I got a weekend coming up. I have my mom and auntie's book club tomorrow, where we will be discussing the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie short stories I talked about last week. And my mom's enjoying this collection, so that makes me very excited. So I hope it'll be a good discussion. I should be back on this channel next week. I'm thinking I might do another video about the Goodreads Choice Awards. Now that I've kicked one possible book that I talked about off of the list, I might talk about a few more that I'll read instead in the maybe mainstream fiction and historical fiction genres. You know, moving away a little bit from sci-fi and fantasy. There's just so much I want to read and have to read, and I'll hopefully find a way to cram them all in. But in the meantime, I hope you all have great weekend plans coming up as well. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.